Hello, folks, and welcome back to the MFA Writers Podcast. I'm Jared McCormick, the host of the show. I just finished the second year of my 3-year MFA program, and now that my semester is over, I've got a bit of free time on my hands for the first time in almost a year. With that time, I've been thinking about the second season of MFA Writers, which will start in July. Our plan is to continue publishing interviews with current MFA students every 2 weeks, with a few special episodes sprinkled in. But we're open to suggestions and love hearing from listeners. And we do take suggestions seriously. For instance, today's episode was requested by listener Amy Peltz. So if you have any ideas for the show or just want to say hi, please send us a direct message on Twitter or Instagram, or you can shoot us an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you have a minute to rate or review the show, we'd prefer you do that on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Ellie Black. Ellie is an award-winning writer, editor, instructor, and poetry MFA candidate entering her third year at the University of Mississippi, where she is the senior poetry editor of the Yalobusha Review. Her poetry can be found in Black Warrior Review, Diagram, Booth, Best New Poets, and elsewhere. Today, she's going to read one of her poems titled, O Destroyer.
O Destroyer. Derail me hard. No, harder. Distract me, destruct me. Defoliate, defenestrate me. Depersonalize me. Demonize and deputize, delegitimize me. Discharge me, disarm me, distort, de-alarm me. Devise a device to delete me, diminutize and eat me. Dynamite me seriously, dial it up and de-alive me, deconstruct me and obstruct me, obfuscate me, obdurate me, disavow, disown me. Dominate, dethrone me. Do what you will with me as long as it gets rid of me. Get it over with and do it. Put an end to me. Our deleterious dynamic demands you to destroy me. Hair dryer in the sink me. Blossoming bleed of ink me. Dehiss and dismiss me. Electric socket kiss me. I do what's predetermined. Conduct the spark you give me. You want me out of here, baby? Join the club. Plug me into my life and drop me in the tub.
That was so cool. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for reading.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Jared.
So you told me before the interview that as you've grown as a writer, you found yourself becoming more experimental with your writing. And the poem you read for us is pretty unique. It's pretty intense. I've got to say, I haven't read anything quite like it, but I felt drawn to it. I was compelled to finish it and really moved by it by the end. So is this something you would have written as a younger poet, or is this the kind of experimentation you were referring to?
In a way, this is very new for me. I have, in the past, in college and in high school, I wrote a lot of, narrative poetry. But in a way, this is kind of like a return to something, I feel, because my first, the first poem, the first, quote unquote serious poem I ever wrote in early high school. I was I don't know what this is. This is just playing around with sounds. So it's something that I've always been interested in. But when I started learning more seriously about poetry, I was real poets don't do that. Real serious poets don't mess around with sounds in that way. And obviously that's wrong. And I've learned since then that this is there's a rich tradition in this kind of sound play. But so it feels really exciting and freeing to me to be able to return to this. I really when I'm doing stuff like this, I always think about, Kathy Park Hong's, poems where she only uses a single vowel. I remember I read those in college and I was just awestruck. So I really love playing around with sound like this. And it's something that I feel that I'm now doing more successfully and with more awareness of the tradition that it comes from.
Well, I'm curious to talk to you about your process, because I find that the more experimental things that I've written have come when I try to forget everything that I know about process and just write, let it flow and trust in revision later. What does your process usually look like when you're writing?
Oh God, this is this is a good question. So sometimes I start with a title. I know that people always are like, oh, you shouldn't start with the title, but sometimes I just come up with a title and I'm like, oh, I think that's fun. I'm going to see if I can build a poem around it. And sometimes I have a single line that I feel I want to build a poem around. Sometimes there's like an experiment in sound that I want to mess with. I just started for this poem, I started churning out letters that start with, or words that start with the letter D. And I just started listing them. And this is kind of what came to that. And I submitted this poem for thesis hours to my advisor in one of the early drafts. She was like, oh, this is really interesting. You should focus on words that have more of a technical, digital, or electrical bent. And I was like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. So this is what we ended up with.
That's so interesting because, we're talking about being experimental and working outside the box, but from what I'm hearing, you needed some rules in place for this poem as you were writing it to kind of stir your creative juices. So I don't know, are those things different, or do they play off of each other? Do they help you as you write to have some kind of rule that you're working under?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the best way, for me at least, to approach poetry is to go as wild as you possibly can within whatever formal constraints you can give yourself. And people talk about the sonnet as being the major poetic constraint is well, it has to be 14 lines. It has to be an iambic pentameter. And obviously there are sonnets that don't do that. But the sonnet is the ultimate form of constraint. And I think a lot of great poetry, and I'm not saying oh, my poetry is great, but I do think that a lot of great poetry comes from that liminal space between constraint and freedom and experimentation. It's you can only, if you're doing something super experimental, if you don't give yourself any rules, at least in my experience, you're going to get overwhelmed. It's the illusion of choice. It's okay, I have too many things to do here. I've got to pick something and run with it.
So what does your revision process usually look like? Is that something you're doing along the way, or are you, as you said, just going wild and then worrying about cleaning it up later?
So yes, so I revise as I write, and then I revise more after I write. For a poet who is now becoming, I think, more experimental, I'm very interested in constraint and in control and in being very, very intentional and careful with my choices. And so I mess with punctuation to the highest degree. I'm is it the or is it a here? And I know this is something that all poets do, but people frequently think well, the more experimental a poet is, the less they care about that stuff, and frequently that is not so. I'm really invested in getting things as tightly controlled as they can possibly be, and so actually sometimes it's really hard for me to just kind of go crazy and just put stuff on the page and then go back and revise it later. I feel compelled to make it right the minute I put it down. So that is one thing that I struggle with in terms of revision.
So how do you know when it's done? Because I run into this problem where sometimes I will over revise something to the point where it loses some energy. How do you know when to stop and let it be?
Yes. So I think that no poet on earth has the right answer to this question. we are all just kind of we don't really know. But what I try to do is I try to stop before I lose that spark. If I still like the poem, then I'm okay, I think I've reached a stopping point here. Or if I've revised it, if I've gone too hard and I've revised it so hard that I don't like it anymore, I'm okay, I've got to put it away for a long time and maybe come back to it later.
Interesting. Yeah. I find the exact same thing. I mean, I'm writing fiction, but oftentimes I reach a point in the revision process where I realize, okay, I just have to put this thing away and come back to it 2, 3, 4 weeks from now when I'm not in this fog of revision where I've just read it 100 times, and you kind of lose touch with what you're going for. So you mentioned to me that Gurlesque is a poetry movement that maybe doesn't quite encompass what you do, but it is at least adjacent to it. And I have to be honest, I had to look up Gurlesque. I hadn't heard of it, and perhaps all the poets listening are laughing at me right now. But in case there are other poetry novices listening who haven't heard of this movement, do you mind describing it and explaining how it has inspired or influenced you, and maybe talk about how your poetry differs from it?
Yeah, of course. So obviously I don't think this is a thing that's like, oh, you're so stupid if you haven't heard of it. But I first heard of the Gurlesque in college. I had this anthology recommended to me by one of my mentors, and I can't remember exactly who it was. I think it might have been Elizabeth Lindsay Rogers. Shout out ELR. It's this anthology called Gurlesque, the New Girly Grotesque Burlesque Poetics, edited by Laura Glenham and Ariel Greenberg. And it's just this anthology of women poets primarily, who write in kind of this similar vein. We've got Brenda Shaughnessy in here, Dorothea Lasky. I'm flipping through, and there's a foreword that I have like a little bit of a definition from. She says, I decided on the term Gurlesque because of the way it sounds like it comes from the stuff that the Gurlesque comes from. 1, the Carnivalesque. 2, the Burlesque and the Neo-Burlesque. 3, the Riot Girls. Also the Grotesque. So it's kind of like this. I would maybe describe it as like a feminist ideal. It's like campy. It's like interested in the feminine, like the hyper feminine. It's interested a lot in sound play. But so I definitely feel like I always describe my work as Gurlesque adjacent. And I feel like I'm not sure what exactly it is that prevents me from being like, yes, I'm a part of the Gurlesque tradition. I think part of it is that a lot of stuff, of course not everything, but a lot of stuff under the Gurlesque label has a real interest in raunch and vulgarity that I don't really like. I'm not really interested in that. I'm definitely interested in reading that stuff, but I don't really have an interest in writing that kind of stuff. But there's like sexual vulgarity to a lot of Gurlesque work. So I tend to say like, oh, I'm close to it, but I'm not quite there.
So maybe it's like partially the like experimentation that you're seeing in that poetry and the sound play that you're seeing in that poetry that has influenced your writing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So when did you happen upon this book and start reading the poetry from this like Gurlesque movement? And did you find that your writing became more experimental after finding this poetry, or was it something you were already trying to do?
So yes, this is a great question. So I probably picked this up junior or senior year of college, maybe while I was working on my undergrad thesis. And I remember reading it and being like, I don't know, this is a little weird for me. Like, I don't really get it. But I like kept the book, and I definitely I don't feel that my work immediately became weirder after reading this book. I feel like I wasn't at a point where I really understood what was going on. And so I just kind of sat with it for a few years. And I recently returned to it. I read it, I think, again over Christmas break, and I was like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now I understand it better, because I've been working to get weirder. I've been making an active effort over the past few years to get weirder in my stuff. And I was like, oh, I remember reading Gurlesque and feeling like, I don't know, that's too weird. I'm in college. But now I feel like I'm okay, I'm ready for it. I can return to it. And I definitely I'm glad that I did.
Yeah, I love, the weirder the better for me. I love weird stuff. There's something about it when I find a piece that's odd in a way that I haven't seen before. It just, it has that energy to it. And I love the idea of finding a book that kind of changes your perspective. Because I've had these moments in my own writing life where I find a collection of short stories that I read and it just something clicks. And I just have to, it makes you want to go write. Those are the best books, I think, and the best things that you can read, the ones that just make you want to go write afterwards. Well, as I said before, this poem you read, it is pretty intense. And some of those intense themes, there's also humor there. And that's what I really love about it. I think it can be difficult to incorporate humor into writing that explores dark themes. But when it's done right, it really elevates a piece, in my opinion. And for me, that's what happened with this poem when I was reading it. So how important is humor to your writing, would you say? Very, very important.
And that's another thing about the Gurlesque, is it's really interested in humor and irreverence. And so I feel like that's another way that I'm aligned with it. But I would definitely say that humor is one of the like fundamental core elements of my work. And I always say like humor versus earnestness, but also like the space between humor and earnestness is where a lot of productive things happen for me. Humor in my work, I just feel like I wouldn't want to write a poem that was just all like 100% misery. And of course, like lots of great poems are 100% misery. But I personally get the most out of kind of reaching into those gray areas and kind of like squishing around. And even and especially the stuff that's uncomfortable to do, like to joke about, and not to joke about like serious topics that affect other people, but to joke about serious topics that like affect me. Like in talking about womanhood and talking about like sexual assault, like in talking about power dynamics that have affected me personally, just like reaching in there and squishing around and being like, okay, how can I express the anxiety and the discomfort that I have like kind of like swirling around inside me? How can I get that on the page in the way that feels most true to how it feels inside my head? And it's not just like 100% like abject misery all the time. Like there is like an element of joking, an element of humor, an element of levity, because that's what humans are like. And so I think it's important to cover all the bases.
So I was thinking about this myself, just like my own experience, like trying to incorporate humor into my own writing. And for me, it's like, it goes back to what we were talking about, like when writing the first draft, just to kind of let go and allow yourself to write something bad, mm-hmm. but like try to find that voice that's just naturally funny and then go from there. I don't know if that's how you work with your writing, but what advice would you have to anyone who's listening, who's trying to incorporate humor into their writing?
I feel, of course, there's like the traditional, like there's that like old stand-up advice that I think like applies to life in general, is like punch up, not down. With that idea in mind, I think just don't try to shut yourself up. Like just let yourself be funny. Like if you're like, oh, well, that sounds stupid, just put it on the page. And you can always cut it later. You can always revise it out later, but just like let yourself do stuff. Like it has taken me a long time to realize, and I'm still not totally there, that I can literally write whatever I want. Like I literally can. There is nothing stopping me, and I don't have to publish all of it, and I can revise it however I want. But I literally can put whatever I want on the page. And that's a really like frightening idea for me. I feel like I can't. And I feel like a lot of people probably feel that way. But my advice, which I also need to better follow, is just recognize there's nothing you're like not allowed to write about your own experiences or in terms of like your interests. Like you don't have to be totally serious and academic all the time. Like you're allowed to be funny.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the beauty of writing, right? Is that you nobody has to read it. If you're experimenting and you want to try something weird and it doesn't work, nobody has to see it, right? Yes. But maybe it will work, and maybe it'll be like full of energy in a way that your other writing hasn't been. So yeah, just go for it. I think it's great advice.
Yeah.
And besides humor, you mentioned some other themes that show up in your writing are pop culture, technology, and womanhood in both normative and non-normative forms. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that and how you decide what to write about when you sit down to write a poem. Are you thinking ahead of time, okay, this is going to be a poem about technology, or are you just letting it flow and those things find their way in?
As far as pop culture goes, I'm really interested in pop culture. Like I always say, if I was getting a PhD or a master's degree, I would be getting it in like digital studies. I'm really interested in like fan studies, fandom culture. Like I'm particularly interested in YouTube, which is maybe weird. But I wrote my undergraduate creative writing thesis project. I wrote a collection of poems about celebrity women, some of which are published. But I've always been interested in celebrity culture. I've always had a fascination with it. I remember I was in like 5th grade. I found out that Marilyn Monroe existed. Absolutely life-changing, as it was for a lot of people at that age. But I wrote like, I don't know, 20, 25 poems all about celebrity women, particularly like tragic figures like Marilyn Monroe, Tonya Harding, but also about like, Kylie Jenner, Lindsay Lohan, Jackie O. But yes, a lot of that was like just trying to reckon with the way that people are perceived, women are perceived, celebrities are perceived. And these are all separate ideas, but things that frequently go together. As far as technology goes, I've always found myself really drawn to images of the digital. I can't totally explain why, but I'm really, really, like, I've had people this semester particularly describe my work as like glitchy, and that is a compliment of the highest order to me. Like, if you read my poem and you're like, this feels like reading a computer virus, then I have done what I've set out to do. Like, I love that. Like, I was meeting with my advisor the other day. She described my poems of having like an element of a digitized spirituality, and I was like, oh wow, that's where we're going. That's like where I'm trying to get. But yeah, I think there's just like something in me that is drawn to this idea of like, what is the difference between a machine and a person, and what is the similarity between a machine and a person. Obviously, I've read Cyborg Manifesto at a formative age. Shouldn't have done that. But to tie that into ideas of womanhood, normative and non-normative, I also write a lot, especially recently, about like inhuman figures such as like robots and androids and aliens and angels. Like, I'm really interested in that right now. And I'm interested in, this is a little hard to explain, but this is my first shot at trying to explain it, about the ways in which I feel personally connected to or disconnected from both an identity of womanhood and an identity of like humanity. I frequently like feel in my life like people like look at me and are like confused, not like look at me like my physical self, but like I have frequently felt like the way that I operate in the world is confusing to people somehow. And so I have dealt with that in my writing, especially recently, by being like, okay, well then how can we kind of like project these feelings onto like these figures who like maybe aren't human, or maybe really want to be human, or maybe really don't want to be human, or are interacting with humans.
And you're in the poetry track at the University of Mississippi, but you told me that you have projects in progress in poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. Ole Miss doesn't have a nonfiction track, but do they offer classes in other genres that you all can take while you're there?
Yes, absolutely. So we have a surprisingly robust nonfiction program for a program that doesn't offer a nonfiction track. We have Kiese Lehman here, we have Beth Ann Finley here, we have Amy Nizuku Matatil, and all of these are like, and others too, but like we have many, many accomplished nonfiction writers as faculty in this program. And usually like every other year, I think there's a nonfiction writing course. I took one with Beth Ann while I was here. A couple of years before that, I know Kiese taught one. You're also welcome to take workshops outside your genre, like that's encouraged here. And we have fiction workshops. I took a fiction workshop as well, and I really enjoyed it. That's one thing that I really like about this program, is that I've heard that at a lot of programs, it's like, no, study your own personal craft, like don't get distracted. But I think there's a lot of benefit in like exploring other genres and working out like what other forms your ideas might take.
So how has working in those genres affected you as a writer of poetry, or just a writer in general?
Yes. So I really enjoyed both of those workshops, the fiction workshop and the nonfiction workshop. And I don't know, because they were both last semester, I don't know if I can yet like see a way that they have like directly impacted my writing. But I think it ties back to that idea that I was talking about earlier about like freedom. Like I I can write prose. Like, just because I'm a poet doesn't mean I have to stick to poetry. If I have an idea that would fit better in a different genre or a different form, I'm allowed to try that form out. My novel project that I was working on in my fiction workshop, I'm now thinking maybe that is actually like a screenplay idea instead. Maybe its best form isn't a novel. But because I've like taken these workshops in these different genres, I feel more comfortable being like, okay, I can just like switch that up. Yeah, I can just try something else instead of being like, oh God, I'm a failure. Like, it didn't work out as a novel. I'm so miserable about this. Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefit to just trying stuff out.
Well, the University of Mississippi MFA program, it hasn't been around for too long, not even 20 years now, but it's earned a reputation for being a pretty good program. It's 3 years. It's fully funded. As I said before, there are tracks in poetry and fiction. The program accepts 8 students each year while maintaining a faculty of like 9 professors, according to the website. So there's about 24 students at any one time to 9 teachers, which is a pretty good ratio. So do you find that you get a lot of time with professors? Is there a lot of individual mentorship?
Yes, absolutely. You can, like, pretty much anybody is accessible at any time. Like I frequently meet with Melissa, my advisor. People are always down to just like chat. And I mean, during non-COVID times, people are always down to just like get a drink, talk about your work. It's very easy to get in touch with faculty, to have like good conversations with faculty. And because the faculty is so large, like you really are going to meet somebody that you vibe with. Like, there's so many options. You're likely going to meet somebody that you're like, okay, like this is a person who really, really gets my work. And if you meet somebody who you're like, I don't know if this faculty member really does get my work, there are other people to talk to. You're not locked into like, oh no, like my advisor doesn't actually understand my work. Like, you can just like go talk to a different faculty member and develop a relationship with them too. Yeah, I think our large faculty is one of the great benefits of this program.
Yeah, and I'm curious how that large faculty affects the workshop experience at Ole Miss. So what do workshops usually look like? Are they pretty small? Are they just for graduate students, or are there mix with like undergraduates as well?
Yeah, so I think workshops generally are capped at 12. And sometimes there are fewer, and sometimes like it runs up to 12. I've never had a workshop with an undergrad, but I think they're maybe like in the fiction workshop this semester or last semester, there was an undergrad. There are sometimes like master's and PhD students who will take workshop if there's room. Like I said, like there's a lot of freedom in class choice, in that regard, at least. But yeah, so workshops look pretty different based on who is teaching them. Like, every professor obviously has their own style. And I won't I won't describe their styles in depth in case they want to keep that on the down low. But for instance, I had a workshop with Derek Harrell this semester, which was fantastic. He's more interested in like how to organize a collection, for instance, or at least in terms of like the workshop. The workshop is interested in like sequencing and collections, whereas I've had other workshops where it's like really like line level, or I've had other workshops where we do like arts and crafts and like visual poetry. There's a lot of different workshop style here, like from the traditional to the more experimental. And again, I feel like just like trying out a bunch of different stuff is going to get you the best results.
And there's also a writer in residence each year at the University of Mississippi. So I'm curious how that works. Does the writer come in and essentially take the duties of a regular professor, running workshops, all of that stuff?
Yes. So the writer in residence program, as far as I'm aware, it alternates every year between a fiction writer and a poet. My first year we had January Gill O'Neill, who is a poet, absolutely fantastic to work with. I love her. But she was here for a year, and now we have Maurice Ruffin, who's also fantastic, but I haven't worked with him directly. But yes, so they teach one semester of undergrad workshop, I think, and then one semester of graduate workshop.
Okay.
So they generally do have the responsibilities of a regular professor. They just teach a class each semester, and then the rest is writing time.
And I mentioned earlier that it's a fully funded program. From what I could tell on the website, 2 incoming students each year, one in poetry and one in fiction, get a fellowship that pays either $14,000 or $16,000 a year, depending on where you look on the website. And those don't require any teaching. But for the rest of the incoming students, they are given a teaching assistantship that pays $11,500 a year. I love that the program's fully funded, but the stipends are on the lower end. So are you teaching or do you have a fellowship?
So I'm not a Grisham Fellow. I am teaching. So there's a lot of stuff changing about the stipend right now, and also there's a lot changing about the website. The website really needs to be updated. We're working on that. But so yes, 11.5 has always been like the base stipend, and technically I think still is, but I don't like. There are still people in the program like third years who are still making that amount, but I think with new incoming students generally, I don't think anybody is, and I could be wrong about this, I don't think anybody is making less than 14. So stipends are like kind of like slowly climbing because they just like, they'll like try to find like an extra supplementary fellowship. They'll like give it. The Grisham isn't the only fellowship. It's the only non-teaching fellowship for incoming students. But like there's like the Ford Fellowship somebody has. I have a fellowship related to the creative writing PhD program here. There's a lot of different kinds of stuff. So I think as time passes, the stipends are kind of like hiking up whenever available, but that is like, it's not always possible because like the University of Mississippi obviously isn't a school with a great arts funding program. But there's a lot of effort, a lot of concerted effort to get those stipends higher. And I think we're working on it.
So the lowest stipend you're going to have is $11,500, but most people get like scholarships and little fellowships that bump that number up a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. I personally am making $16,500.
I know that you do freelance editorial work on the side, so I'm curious whether the stipends that you all are making are enough to live comfortably and concentrate on your writing, or are a lot of students having to take jobs on the side to like make ends meet?
Yeah, I know a lot of folks do like freelance work. I know a lot of folks do food service work in town. It's a big food town. So there are a lot of restaurants to work at. I think, yeah, for the most part, people are doing something on the side, but some people aren't. Some people are making it just fine without. Some people have family support or partner support. But yeah, I would say that most people are like, at least like publishing frequently enough to be getting paid some extra money.
And then the website also says that teaching assistants sometimes work as graders and other times teach comp or entry-level creative writing, but it isn't clear how many classes each student is responsible for each semester. So are you teaching 1 or 2 classes per semester?
Yes. So the way that it works is generally your first year you are working as a TA and you are assigned to a single instructor of record and you are like the TA for that literature class. So for instance, I was the TA in my first semester for English 226, which is Survey of British Literature. I would go to that professor's lecture twice a week. And then once a week, I would have breakout sessions, discussion sections with 3 groups of like about 20 or fewer students. So I was teaching 3 sections, but they all belonged to the same larger seminar class. And then in the second year, generally speaking, so there's an option to take 617 teaching composition in your second semester. So if you take that, you are then able to move into the Department of Writing and Rhetoric and be an instructor of record generally for a composition class. This semester, because of COVID, it was a little bit different. They did like kind of like a TA situation where in the first semester, everybody was working with an instructor of record and like being like kind of a TA or a co-instructor based on the professor's wants and needs. I happened to get an instructor of record slot this spring. I think I was the only one. But yeah, things have been kind of different because of COVID. And then in the third year, of course, you can TA, you can do composition. There's also work in the Writing Center in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric, so you can work in the Writing Center if that is what you would prefer. And there are also dissertation non-teaching fellowships for a single semester in the third year for MFAs.
And so do you have some say in which one of those duties you're going to have?
So not really in the first year, but for instance, if you know you don't want to teach comp, then you don't have to take 617. Or if you if you know that you don't get along with the professor that you have been assigned to TA for, then you can switch. They're really liberal about letting folks switch around. So this year, for I think the first time, or at least the first time in a long time, they sent around a preference form. So we got to kind of list and rank our preferences. I think they're just kind of trying that out. So that may or may not be implemented in the future.
And when you are the teacher of record, are you teaching one class or are you teaching two?
Yes, teaching one. So I taught one section of Writing 102 pop culture this semester.
Well, let's talk a bit about Oxford, Mississippi, where the school's located. Mississippi is a complicated place with a complicated history and a complicated present.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine some students will find the idea of moving to a fairly small town in the Deep South to be a bit daunting. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about living in Oxford, which, Oxford has a great literary tradition. It's the home of William Faulkner, and you often see Oxford ranked as one of those best small towns in America to live, whatever that means.
Yes.
I'm not sure. But how has your experience been living in Oxford, and how has it been for other people in your cohort?
Yeah, so I love Oxford. Not everybody loves Oxford. I really love Oxford. I consider it the best place I've ever lived. I'm from a small town in Arkansas originally. I lived there until I went to college, at which point I went to a really small college in Conway, Arkansas. And then I lived in Little Rock for a while, and then I lived in Washington State for a while. Then I came to Oxford, and I was like, wow, I really, really like it here. I am accustomed to small towns. And when people describe Oxford as a small town, I kind of seize up a little bit. I'm because I don't consider Oxford to be a small town. It has I think a legal population of 25,000. And when the students are in town, that population doubles. So it ends up around 50K.
Okay.
But I, again, having been born and raised in a town of 10,000 people, I'm Oxford is a small city. But people are always oh, Oxford, such a small town. It's crazy how little there is to do here. I'm there's so much to do here. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
But you do have to drive an hour to get to the nearest Target. You have to drive an hour to get to Trader Joe's. Memphis is just an hour away, but just an hour away is a lot of driving to some people. I don't consider it a lot of driving because I had to drive an hour to do anything my whole life. But I consider Memphis to be really accessible, easy to get to. And I love the food scene in Oxford. I love the arts and literary scene in Oxford. I think there's plenty to do here during non-COVID times. I think there's something to do every night of the week here, if that's the kind of stuff that you are interested in. There's a vibrant queer scene here. I really like it here. But there are some folks in the program from larger cities who are oh my God, it's so small. I hate having to drive the extra hour to go to Target. So I would my advice would be make sure that you are actually comfortable living in a small city if this is a program that's on your list.
And, you mentioned the literary and arts scene in Oxford. I'm curious to hear about that. And I'm also curious to hear you talk about just the community within your cohort and if, people are spending a lot of time together. And besides the size of the town, have you heard people complaining about the community at all? Do people feel comfortable living in Oxford, Mississippi?
Yeah. So as far as the community and the program, I came to this program in large part specifically because of the community. I had several better funded offers. This was actually the least amount of money that I was offered, but I was able to visit. And when I visited, I was just so struck by how warm and kind and compassionate everyone was, and how deep and great the sense of community felt here. And I didn't necessarily want to let that go. But yes, I see a lot of folks in the program. I hang out with folks in the program. I also hang out with folks who aren't necessarily in the MFA program. We see a lot of the MA and PhD students. I'm friends with a lot of crit folks. I think that the sense of the program community is really fantastic. As far as the community and town goes, like obviously, as you mentioned, like Mississippi is a complex place with a complex history. And there was a Confederate statue in the middle of campus until very recently. There's still a Confederate statue in the town center. But there are also, concerted efforts to get those statues removed. There is like a vibrant population of people who want this place to be better. And at least to me, that feels reassuring. That may not be enough for some people to want to live here or move here. But again, having lived in like a really conservative small town my whole life, like the fact that there are people here actually willing to do some work, put some work in, like is quite refreshing to me.
We talked a little bit about the literary history in Oxford. I'm curious, what kind of extracurricular opportunities are available through the program?
Yes. So like you mentioned, I work on the Yallabusha Review, which is our literary magazine. It's not a paid position. It's a volunteer position. It's a labor of love, but I do really, really love it. The Yallabusha Review, as we were talking about experimental work earlier, like the Yallabusha Review has a more experimental bent, and it is also responsible, I think, in a really fun way for a lot of like the increased weirdness of my work. Just like reading the weird stuff that people send in that I'm like delighted by inspires me to do like different and more fun stuff. So I love working on the Yallabusha Review. I love it when the new folks come in and hang out with us. And I'm really excited to move into an editorial position there. Broken English. I was also this year one of the co-hosts of our MFA reading series, which is called Broken English. During the first semester, all the first years will read over the course of the semester. And during the second semester, all the third years will read. And that was a really fun, rewarding experience to host. The second year is always host because the first years and the third years are busy reading. But yes, it was really fun, really rewarding to get to like organize these events to just like celebrate the work that people are doing here. Let's see what else. Longleaf. So Longleaf is like a writing conference that takes place in Seaside, Florida. That is like kind of like has a vague association with our program because of Matt Bondurant, who is one of our faculty here. He's associated with that, with Longleaf. And it's like this really cool opportunity where you get to basically like go to a fun beach in Florida for like a week. It's a conference that's available to all people. But every year during non-COVID times, 2 students, I believe, are selected to attend. And I think students of all years are considered. I think that's pretty much it for like in-program elective stuff.
Well, I mean, that all sounds great. Before we go, I just want to give you the last word. If there's anything we missed or any advice that you have, or I was kind of curious about like what the program is looking for in a candidate, if there's like an Ole Miss candidate. But anything else you want to add before we go for it.
Yeah. So the first thing that I want to say, because you were kind of talking earlier, we were talking about the stipend, and I do want to say, like, I frequently say that this program would be one of the top ranked programs in the country if the stipend weren't so low. And again, like that's being worked on, but I truly, truly believe in this program. I truly, truly love this program. I think our faculty are incredible. And I think like the work that people are doing here is really, really interesting and beautiful. And I think people are often surprised to hear that. They're like, oh, like, well, I mean, it's just like in Mississippi, but people frequently discount the South. People frequently discount smaller towns, smaller cities. And I want to be very clear that I take this program really, really seriously. And I encourage everybody else to do so because my peers here are doing absolutely incredible work. And I really encourage folks to apply as well. And I also want to say that as far as like what a University of Mississippi student is like, that's the fun thing about this program is there isn't one. Everybody is so different. Like there's such a diversity of styles and aesthetics here that I find so incredible and rewarding in workshop and in just like trading work with people and in just like talking about craft and form with people. And even in just like having friends. Like there is no like University of Mississippi sound. People always make that joke, like you go to an MFA program, all your style gets ironed out, you come out sounding like an MFA student. That absolutely does not happen here because there is no uniform voice. There are people who write in all manner of different ways, and everybody's just as excited about that as they are about all the other stuff that's going on. So I would say to anybody who's interested in applying, just like, don't worry about like trying to like fit a certain aesthetic. Even like if you're like an avid reader of the Yellow Review, you're like, well, I got to submit my most experimental stuff. There really aren't actually that many experimental writers in the program right now. There are plenty of like narrative writers. There are plenty of confessional and post-confessional writers. There are people with a lot of different stuff going on. So yeah, I would say that that's a major strength here. And I would encourage anybody to consider applying and to just like submit the work that you like the best.
Great advice and great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jared.